Hello everyone, today we talk about the new writing in vernacular during essentially the 11th and the 13th century. This is not going to be precisely a literature video. We never actually made anything like that. We could start taking into consideration things like, I don't know, medieval literature, philosophy, or even history of art. More specifically, just tell me if you're interested in it. I can do it if you want. But and we have never done this on Schwerpunkt, but objectively the history of literature is crucial to understand a lot. And this seems a very banal statement, of course, but in the sense that we sometimes think essentially that like literature is one thing and history is something else, or at least that for didactic sake that there is a sort of division of the two fields, and objectively it is true because literature is usually studied mostly by people who have a more directly specific interest in fact for literature itself, for philology, linguistics, etc., rather than what we do in history, largely more like a social history. And naturally the difference is blurred. You can even say that I think historians possibly deal more like philosophically speaking with a literary approach than other than actual than a scientific one. For example, I myself currently I'm carrying out this research chiefly on narrative sources, because narrative sources are objectively some of the most single goal precious elements we have to understand that world, right? You can have a dramatically important archaeological datum, but even if it can speak for many things, it still doesn't tell you a story in the same way someone that is essentially writing what you're let's say about problems that are essentially the same that you have personally can do. Right, and there is a lot of prejudice towards literary sources in this regard, narrative sources especially. This has to do also largely with, which country you are from, because certain the reason of this division actually stems for the same history of literature in those countries. Like, if a particular type of narrative, for example, has not been terribly developed or was most evidently bent to the will of a certain patron and ruler, etc. Well, you are automatically, as a culture, as a historical culture, not gonna have a dramatic interest in the let's say, or faith in the, or hope in the objectivity of that source, right? You already know that fundamentally that is emanated from that specific context. You already know it's biased in a kind of, beyond the repair in order to understand certain specific things. Other countries have produced objectively kind of like, especially when we talk about chronicles, strictly speaking, that comes from annalistics, especially, not entire works that were dedicated to praise one king or one prince, but telling a story, I don't know, of your city and what happens. And especially given that these stories were read by the whole community, right, and throughout the whole spectrum, the whole political spectrum, it's obvious that in that context, well, that source is still biased, because every source is, but it has a much greater significance that you can't find elsewhere. So we still suffer in some ways, of for example, I deal with this kind of chronicles telling the truth, and I largely base myself on them. But for example, I still have a strictly kind of a more scientific, narrowly meant, interest for kind of extrapolating actual information about a certain sphere of warfare from those chronicles, always knowing that they don't tell the truth, because no source can do effectively, but at least they can be more or less realistic or accurate about certain aspects. And incredibly enough, especially by confronting lots of them, This seems to be the case, but the case I study is the one of an area in which objectively, in fact, literary production, in vernacular especially, was dramatically advanced. And you don't find this elsewhere. But this produces, however, the same chronicles I study, for example, are studied normally by people who have a strictly philological or linguistical interest, so that there is plenty of historians that more or less actually deal with either similar things I deal with, or that have necessarily to mention chronicles because they tell a lot of information, but they usually do it as historians proper towards another direction, in fact, kind of reconstructing another field that is outside of the chronicle in itself as a literary work, which is a very, very different approach from the linguist, the codicologist, the guy who looks at the written tradition of these manuscripts, etc., that makes substantially a different work, and very often has also a different job, because it's not a historian. It's in fact a philologist or someone else like that. It has a less strictly, social interest in this regard, and just looks at the piece of literature in itself. So that's why I think it's important to approach literature when, in this regard, being aware that most of these information this information can actually be interpreted in different ways from which the one is traditionally done. And it's a gold mine. I mean, just look on YouTube. Today we will talk, for example, in part, we will mention at least Chrétien de Troyes. And we made a video about him recently. It was not specifically about him, but it was about Clichy. And we, by curiosity, I looked on YouTube how many people had made something, a video about mentioning or talking about specifically Chrétien de Troyes, and I discovered that basically there was a very few about it, and it was exclusively from the side of other philologists or linguists, etc. I mean, people who studied literature fundamentally, not who study history. And it's at that point that I can speak in terms of dimensionally speaking. I can't come up with an introduction like this by saying, look, that one of the single most important text producers of the time, and one of the greatest artists and talents, and but also a great a person who had been serving, in fact, in those environments that naturally were making him write that on purpose and commission, etc. But that was effectively looking at those environments and telling us, whoever was reading, what that should have been like, and that can tell us so much, for example, about the psychology of these people, who can open to us many horizons, many views, many conceptions that go beyond the strictly literary side of the story, also about politics, about war. In fact, specifically that video I made was about that, and about tournaments, right? And in fact, probably who studies Clichy doesn't care very much about the tournament in itself, but if you read the passage when Clichy, in fact, does that, and there is plenty of information that actually dramatically fascinating about this psychology of warfare, but also about certain practical technicalities of tournament combat. And I've found none of this out there, and I'm sure there is people who have researched, who have treated this on somewhere, I mean, academically speaking, on papers and studies, etc. But I was astonished by the fact that, culturally speaking, in terms of popular culture, we still basically can't distinguish the two things. And this is evident because objectively, not even medievalists normally study these things. I mean, I personally didn't study this stuff nor in school, nor at university, for example, and yet I have my share of years now studying medieval history, and I didn't do that. Like, and why? Because generally speaking, we think it's maybe not important, or at least there has to be a specific interest in, I don't know, in history of literature or philology to approach these topics. And there is a conflict as well, a cased conflict, let's say, because I can think, for example, that philologists may not care or anything about, I don't know, medieval tournaments in their technical side when they're actually studying cliché, because, you know, that's a masterpiece from a literary point of view. They may think that I'm actually an ignorant because, in fact, I don't know about that stuff, just artistically, about, you know, all the various literary influences and so on. But that's the reason why I think the two things should be blended a little bit. And albeit this happens, I still think it's not enough, quantitatively speaking, and we should find out some, you know, that we can speak, and that's why I make these videos, that we should speak and we must speak about this stuff, and spreading awareness about the actual usefulness that can derive from knowing these sources, because essentially history is about knowing as much as you can, but in a critical fashion, that is not just reading something out, because everybody can read cliché, right, but not everybody can understand what it means, or and that's why you need specialists, but that's also why you need to develop a kind of an interdisciplinary approach that is not just, okay, let's make people from different backgrounds meet every once in a while and that they kind of still keep talking to themselves. Let's simply understand that there is a plethora of sources of the most different types that should be at the base of the of an historical formation, because history is literally about everything. There is no limit. Like the philologist can have a limit in that sense. This student of you know, literary subject can be limited in that regard. History theoretically is meant to encompass every single thing about that. I mean, theoretically, the historian should be the guy that should pick from all of these specialists and put something together to make a synthesis, right? And that doesn't work if you have a selective view of the picture. And this is actually a very important question, methodologically speaking. I mean, how can you achieve that? How can you find an effective model of education where you can make this fit in? But today I would like to talk, telling the truth, in fact, about vernacular writing, and just at the limit of rarefaction in this area of Central and Southern Europe, fundamentally, that between especially the 12th and 13th century had an extraordinary literary development, right? And let's start observing a bunch of things now. For example, from the whole thing, as you know, starts this great revival of medieval civilization during the 11th century. Ideally, actually, there is no limit, no temporal limit to this growth that has started from a couple of centuries at least. But at this point, there are substantial differences that can be studied through, in fact, several points of view, including the literary production. And in fact, it's rather the 12th century where we see a massive expansion in this regard. When in Europe, we can spot the affirmation of a phenomenon that before was almost completely unknown. That was essentially the put down in writing of texts in vernacular. Now you may say, well, but this is not a big deal, right? You know, but what's the point? Well, it's really an enormous problem, you know, because we don't know much about how people spoke and where all of these languages that we actually speak today had come from, largely, chiefly because they were not written down, right? Everything was written in Latin normally. Naturally, the more the northern you go, and the earlier you find vernacular texts written down, right? At the same time, in certain areas of the north, you don't find writing for longer time. So actually, it's really the middle ground. It's usually France and Germany that produced for the first time, like in more extensive fashion actually, more more vernacular texts, right? And that's the base for us to understand a lot. And this has nothing to do actually with the spread of literacy. Like for higher spreads of literacy, for example, these areas would still remain largely based on oral tradition, right? It's really a matter of combining these two aspects, and also the practice with Latin, because it's obvious that Central Europe was somewhat, superficially Latinized, right? And the rest was, the the majority of the people would keep expressing itself naturally, spontaneously, even in the written tradition, in vernacular, more easily, right? So it's obvious that in certain areas of Southern Europe, people kept essentially to write in Latin because the spoken language was fairly similar to it, and everybody kind of still understood Latin. In certain areas, I don't know, Germany, nobody knew Latin normally, like unless they were educated in, through ecclesiastical structures, etc. But they spoke another language or another branch of the Indo-European languages. So it's a very different story. And this, in fact, has nothing to do with literary production proper, because there are certain areas, such as France and Italy, that will produce, in this sense, an enormous lot of stuff that had actually a greater written practice. Like Italy especially had the highest in Europe, even compared to the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine Empire didn't have this dramatic spread of literacy among the commoners as much as Italy had, for example. And Italy begins very, very late to write in vernacular, simply because Latin still functioned, right? And when Italian is kind of born as a literary language, it's not because it was invented at that point or Latin had, transformed itself at that point. This vernacular existed since centuries. Simply, people didn't write it down because Latin still worked without particular problems for people to understand it, right? So this is very interesting, and that's why and for not talking about all the phonetical problems, I mean, all of those languages that hadn't had a contact with Latin or Greek and their alphabets that were at that point the base of everything, because either there was Glagolitic and other from which eventually also Cyrillic would come out, but so there were other systems of writing, but they were all derived essentially from Latin and Greek alphabet. And not just in Europe, by the way. And what I'm saying here is that there were sounds, however, in other populations, chiefly the Germanic or Slavic ones, but not only, there were also the Ugro-Finnic ones, for example, that didn't quite, that had sounds that who wrote in Latin in certain areas of Europe or in Greek hadn't bothered himself to try to find new expressions for, because those were new languages that were coming just now, and this caused problems that are reflected still in the modern vernaculars of those languages, because during medieval times these languages were given kind of a way, they had to be written down, which had never been done. Think about all the phonetic exceptions that exist in English. That derives essentially from the fact that it was difficult to frame certain sounds that were presented in the Old English phonetics with the associations of to the Latin alphabet that is actually pretty dry. The Latin alphabet is, every letter is corresponds to a single sound fundamentally. Even think about vocals. In English, there is never a dry vocal. It's always kind of mixed between two vocals. You never get straight a or things like that. It's always like a, e, or something like that, and that is a problem, because objectively there weren't other systems of alphabetic systems and points of reference that could be adopted or were created, because at that point simply Latin dominated the cultural educational structures, and there was no other option. Um, there are, let's say, exceptions to it's obvious that the 11th century is not the moment in which vernacular languages were written down for the first time. We have that since the ancient world, telling the truth. Think about Wulfila's Bible in Gothic, right? That is, however, one of the few evidence of vernacular translations in Germanic vernacular, in that case, of certain passages of the holy texts or other simple liturgical formulas. For example, the formulas of baptism, right? That were like what every Christian had more or less to know. In fact, I think because they had to baptize children, and but it stuck to that. And just think, in fact, the Carolingian Empire is very meaningful in this regard. When at the time of Charlemagne, like the Franks were Christianized since when 300 years essentially, and they still basically didn't know Latin. Like not even the clergy. I mean, the only person, like the only class at that point was normally capable of knowing Latin. They didn't know that. They didn't know how to read the Bible. They made terrible doctrinal modification because they simply couldn't understand Latin, and they said things that were obviously mixed with their own vernacular, and creating essentially meanings that were completely different from the ones that the creed and this other liturgical formulas were about. And that was a huge problem for the Franks, for example. At the point, Charlemagne had to reform culturally the Carolingian clergy, and that actually worked. It was a successful thing. They pulled it off, and that also was the base actually for the standardization of Western culture. Like, thanks to Carolingians, objectively, Western Europe has this, from a period in pre-Carolingian times where essentially every single region spoke and wrote. This is very important as well, because it also was a matter of script in a different way. In Britain you had insular script. In Spain you had Visigothic script. In Francia you had the Merovingian script. In Italy you had the Longobards script. I mean, everything was different in that regard. At the point they couldn't even read each other, right? Carolingians operate this kind of homogenization on the base of what they thought it was the ancient Roman script, which was actually cursive of the late Roman Empire. And that gave birth to the script that we still use of italics. Essentially, there was, modern italics that we use now is a product of the Renaissance, but still based essentially on the medieval tradition that had gotten those models from the small letters of late Roman cursive, essentially. But aside from this. Just for telling you how the magnitude of problems that we have even in looking at certain things, and it's obvious that until you don't have the actual vernacular written down, right, which is not what it was spoken like. Always bear it in mind, right? We have a lot of hypotheses, like linguists, phonologists can tell us a lot about how these languages actually sounded. We know it to a good degree, but we don't have. There weren't recorders at the time, and we don't know what it did exactly sound like. But this is valid like for every language. It was written down. I mean, do you think, I don't know, that classical Latin, that was the actual that first of all we know the actual pronunciation. We really do not. We have a good idea what it could sound like, but we know essentially Cicero's Latin. What the average, I don't know, shoemaker in the periphery of Rome spoke like we or even wrote by a certain standard. We don't actually know. And we know it could change wildly. Also, and the evidence of this is how actually even the same Romance languages kind of differentiated from each other in post-Roman times in that regard, albeit still being Romance languages in lands that had formerly not had that Italic language. So that's particularly important as well. So such episodes, such few evidences from previous times in the 11th centuries are actually exceptional, are scanny, they confirm rather than contradict this rule that vernacular was not written down. Naturally, there is a lot also about, for certain countries we get, actually for all countries in a certain degree, depending on the concrete amount of evidence, we can kind of track even the passage from kind of previous languages into the modern ones. Like we do know at which point, I don't know, more or less what was spoken in I don't know, in late medieval, in late antique Gaul, transition into what is today's French, right? We do know when Latin in Italy passed into what is kind of more or less today's Italian, and there is no sharp differentiation, by the way, because especially in these Romance languages where Italian and French are the closest, obviously, languages to French more than Spain, especially in the written form, to Latin. And there are a lot of continuities as well, but there is a moment in which these distinctions happened, and these territories, by the way, were unified later on, historically, during the times of national states, etc. But naturally, every place kind of spoke differently, so there are a lot of different shades in this regard. So what happens, however, in the 11th century is the flourishing, especially in what is today's France in its entirety. Right here, we're not talking about France specifically as what that modern French is Langue d'Oil. So it basically derives from northern France, and simply because this was this kind of Frankish empire that expanded over the rest, that exported its own Parisian, its own Langue d'Oil language, but also in the south that spoke the Languedoc Occitan, right? And these two areas produced in parallel some of, in fact, the most important literature of the time, between especially the 11th and the 12th century, that were the leading, that was the leading cultural centers in Europe. At this time, France was basically exporting culture like crazy, but not just in terms of, I don't know, literature, stuff like that, but actual political, military, and social models that were becoming essentially European up to a certain extent. Think about, I don't know, the Normans who invade England. That is literally, there is a Frenchization in part of Anglo-Saxon culture. The same goes with the French that sees, I don't know, southern Italy, that and exports feudalism in there, and the same goes with parts of Spain, even indirectly, of course, because the French political structures were terribly were like from the good side of history, in the sense that the societies also throughout all of Europe were essentially heading towards that same direction by themselves. But there was also a big deal of actual export in this regard. Same goes for Germany. Germany receives this strong cultural influx, as we will see now with the Minnesänger in the Rhineland, especially also in southern, in Swabia, in Bavaria. And as you know, France, as we've just said, is divided in these two big linguistical areas. In the north, the Langue d'Oil, or Old French, and which is essentially this region's north of the Loire River, and in the south with of the Languedoc, right, in southern France, and there is this flourishing of vernacular literature in both the Langue d'Oil and the Languedoc. This vernacular literature assumes, as it's known, in these two different regions, two also two different characters respectively. In the north, it's epics, the epopee that the most famous example being the Chanson de Roland, to especially have the greatest success in the first phase, especially among this audience of essentially of warriors, of knights. This is a knightly culture that are developing, by the way, an ethos on their own, right? Also as a class of aristocrats, right? This is not just even about the Western Frankish monarchy proper, because at this point the Carpathians are still essentially confined in the Ile-de-France, but there are many other power. Think about the Count of Champagne. Think about there are a lot of big and powerful dynasties in France that have their own courts, that are centers of power, of wealth, and can attract these artists as well. But these are not just minor figures. That sometimes they are the lords themselves that are actually very fond of this, especially in the south, as we will see. But the ethos that is being formed here is the one of the Christian knight, right? That is at the service, ideally, of the weak, of women, and of the oppressed. And there is all this sense, like northern French culture is more stern, is even more spiritual. Northern France develops this idea of develops further, actually, this idea of the sacralization of monarchy, of this purity, of this strong inner spirituality inherent to the monarchy and its culture, but it's very military at the same time. So it's very rigid in many ways. Southern France is different. Southern France is much more passional. It's much more about actual love. It's love poetry that has the greatest importance, and that's what it's known, in fact, as the courtoise or courtly poetry that fascinates. In fact, the public of the same courts were. There are actually many knights even in here. Like southern France is also kind of wealthy and powerful. It's somewhat more fragmented politically speaking, but there are also very big, powerful centers. Think about the Duchy of Aquitaine, and the County of Toulouse, for example. But there are all these, in fact, many more. Let's say bachelor warriors, bachelor knights that essentially compete to obtain the favor of the wife of their own lord, right? This is the the impossible love with the wife of the boss, essentially. And it's naturally this was a very carnal, these were cultures that would develop very interesting, also psychologically and anthropologically speaking, very intense, kind of emotional experiences. Think about Catharism, or whatever it was like, actually, aside from what papal propaganda has pictured it like. But this sense, there was a strong contrast, almost schizophrenic, telling the truth, between the bodily, passional and material world of southern France were very wealthy, very rich, very passionate in that sense, and this need of typical Christian need for purification, spirituality, typical of Platonic traditions, and in fact that develops in this literary models Platonic love as such. Right, and we know actually reality was very different. Like these worlds were, I won't want to say they were necessarily more promiscuous than others, but I mean they were, like, throughout all history, sex has always been there, pretty intensively, and especially sometimes in those eras that were pretending like that there were more pure, more chaste. Who knows? Maybe just in northern France it happened the same, but it's more difficult, and I can't tell you why, because northern France was much more dynasticized, and therefore there was a much greater control even on sexual behavior. I presume, that than in the south. It was more fluid. It was more. There was closer to. There was probably less social stratification by certain standards. So that also entailed kind of an easier possibility of, social promotion through marriage. Actually, we know throughout all, not just France, but say Frankish Europe at this time, that, I mean, for a knight, probably the single most important thing in his career was actually scoring like with a good marriage, like usually marrying this rich widows, and that's why they were also hoping that, to point on the lord's wife, because usually women married when they were very, very young, with men that were already kind of mature, old grown. So there were actually a lot of widows in that regard. By the way, men were engaged in continuous warfare, especially in France. It was, as you know, military professionalism was out there. These guys were on campaign throughout the whole year, right? So there were these connections that have to do, strictly speaking, also with actually patrimonial strategies and so on, that are important to know in the first place when looking at these worlds. So essentially, northern and southern France are a bit like the people who could embody these could be easily Louis VII of France and his wife, he eventually divorced from Eleanor of Aquitaine, right? That eventually would marry Henry II of England. That were very different in this regard. They were really they were part of two different cultures. The first one much more stern, spiritual, rigidly, disciplined, Christianly speaking. The other much more libertine and sensual and opened in that regard. So two incompatible models. I don't know how much Henry II. I mean, the English were kind of more direct, probably for other, but these are really important comparisons you can make at a cultural level that would be important to observe further. Always bearing in mind, by the way, England was another very important center of these form of literature that actually were, for example, think about the Arthurian cycles that were taken from France, but deriving in fact from the Brittonic, the Brittonic cycle coming from the British tradition, essentially. So aside from this, think about this is a okay. There is no need to expand further on the historical context. I mean, this is a moment of crusades, of also great of consolidation, actually, of the feudal rule proper. So even the codification of certain behaviors and the role of vassals and knights in society was very important, and literature served for consolidating this as well, right? So both in northern and in southern France, poems were more like recitated or sang than actually read, right? First of all, because knights normally couldn't read, and secondly, because objectively oral tradition had always been like that, and we will see it better with the Minnesänger, for example, some of whom weren't even literate, like in Germany especially. They were still at this point coming out of the forest still, and so we do know, however, that from especially for example a lot of iconographic sources, that knights and dames were substantially often capable of writing. They were busy in writing, and not just in that, as you can imagine, and to read, rather than just writing, mostly reading these texts. Think about the fatal reading of the Lancelot from the side of Paolo and Francesca in Dante's comedy, for example. They eventually they're punished in hell, but that's typical of the French. In fact, even the same Dante was bred. He was educated in France as well, and he had he remained soaked with all of these models, so that his time had been seized like crazy by the Italians, and that's a most famous episode of the most famous medieval work that exemplifies this forbidden love between these two, Paolo and Francesca, in a lordly Italian context, who are essentially reading, that they fall in love, that they kiss each other, finally, while reading the Lancelot, which is one of the most typical Arthurian romance characters, mediated from, the French tradition. And what is interesting is looking at the authors of these works. Well, these essentially continued to belong to the elites. Like, there were other singers, and and these also came from kind of different backgrounds, like socially speaking. But the important thing is that the main composers were still lords. For example, the anonymous author of the Chanson de Geste had used materials that circulated since Carolingian times, right? But that were at this point genially re-elaborated, and he was probably a clergyman, was active at the court of the Dukes of Normandy. Laymen were instead the southern troubadour, troubadour actually, I think, of the troubadouric tradition, in fact, that, however, were still all part of the aristocracy and of the Duke William IX of Aquitaine, and many of them were knights, right? It's very fascinating that this is literature written by actual warriors. That is rare in medieval times. Like, not so rare in this regard, and especially not in the sense that these guys didn't have all their own set of songs, of oral traditions, etc. Actually, they were full of that since the ancient world, literally, because the concept of of the warrior technically is there since, and these songs had a deeper meaning that weren't just a secularized, narrative that we can read today with a modern eye. They were something that they used literally to boost their morale, to feel part of something, to believe in something, right? But the point is that this stuff is getting written down now. This is the really big difference, and these were people who fully participated in the political and military life of the time at the highest levels as well. And next to these products that are naturally profane in theme, as you understand, were written down also other compositions of religious character, and especially a geographic character, telling the truth, all in vernacular, such as the most famous Chanson de Geste, which is this poem dedicated to the Roman Saint Alexis that is destined to have a European success. The flourishing of the French literature, to whom participated in the 12th century also some women, there was a substantial number of women among these poets, kind of spread fast also in the neighboring countries, right? And it's probably in Germany that, especially translation of the poems of Chrétien de Troyes, opened the way to a very rich, kind of, we can say, native German production that touched perhaps its apex in the Swabian age, at the time of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, with the spread of love poetry, the Minnesänger, right? And the reasons are, like, at this time the Swabians are essentially spanning now between Central Europe and the Mediterranean, and therefore they're closely in contact with southern France, with Italy, and therefore they really open even to their own, even oral traditions as well to this particular. And the Minnesänger are essentially considered in fact something like the topics, the themes are essentially the same of the French tradition, but they add to it a character that has like all its artistical and cultural depth from a pre-existing German tradition that has to do also with, I mean, echoing actually even the ancient Germanic sagas. This in a courtly. This is the interesting thing out there, that they talk about Siegfried, or killed in the think about Dietrich von Bern, and these are all figures that mix in fact the ancient pagan past also with this kind of more courtly model derived from, actually, technically the Arthurian legends, where the Arthurian cycle is still a pagan fast, for example, by a certain degree at least. Obviously was Christianized in the 12th century, but this is the problem, we don't know excessively much also about the before. Like, we know these things were taken from something that existed before, but since it was not written down, because it was oral and in vernacular in Latin, it couldn't be rendered in Latin, and it wasn't not so considered as so high to be rendered to be written down in vernacular. Which was, we don't know much about it. This is the real problem. So we know, of course, much more of the actual medieval tradition that surely knew much more, folkloristically speaking, traditionally speaking, than us about times like, I don't know, the migration era, where, for example, the Nibelungen League takes place, or the early medieval times, where that, however, they knew about. And this is something, if you think about it, if you stop thinking about, you really want to tear your heart apart, like, because it's terrible that we lost this knowledge, this thinking. That's why also studying military history is so important, because actually you can find part of that at us, anthropologically speaking, by analogies, by some form of criticism, trying to carve out the relics of that belief, of those beliefs, of that. Think about the Carmina that, according to Tacitus, the Germanic warriors sang in the forest. When they came to collect their bodies after the battles. They were essentially spells. They were magic spells. They had that function, and don't think that, I don't know, a 12th century German knight conceptually was very far, mentally speaking, from that. They had an extremely primitive mindset. It was extremely close to that. It was actually a pretty also deeply militarized one. So that's why it's so fascinating to look at the Minnesänger specifically. But there are many other traditions, by the way. There are also many points of contact. I don't know, I advise you, if you really want to laugh, there are even satirical works like Reinhard Fuchs, by Heinrich the Glickesherr. That's, for example, the satire to Frederick I Barbarossa. That was written in Alsace. There was a German land at the time, but still obviously pretty close to France anyway. And and you find the mix. And by the way, also linguistically speaking, this is amazing stuff. Like, if you know a bit like either French or German, that's powerful to read them, and they're frankly easy to read, because especially works in Middle High German are, like, if you know modern German, they're easy to translate. It takes just a little bit of, if you take the Grimm vocab dictionary, you can sort things out pretty easily with a little Middle High German grammar. But it's not over here, because probably the greatest developments of these traditions were the ones of the imitation of Provençal poetry in Italy. But not in Italy like Italy would have a dramatic literary development towards the 13th to 14th century, and that will rocket to the stars with humanism, the Renaissance, etc. But first, actually, the greatest center of literary development in this regard was the Sicilian court of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, right? Palermo. And in here, really, it was a mix of so many other different influxes and traditions. Like regions like Sicily, like Tuscany, were dramatically close to southern France. Tuscany, especially also in language, like Occitan is dramatically similar to Italian, and especially in Provence, in the eastern, from the Italian side. And by the way, I don't know, and just for this, I mean, these models would last so long. For example, Dante was about to write his comedy in Occitan, not in Italian, better in Tuscan, in Florentine more specifically. Because that was what all the literature was about. I mean, Dante, for example, we're kind of lucky that he lived in a kind of a republic that was pretty open and receptive, like even towards vernacular, and that's why, thank God, he wrote the comedy in Italian, to the benefit of all world civilization. But for example, all the courts of Lombardy, northern Italy, these were heavily kind of aristocratic, at these times at least, centers, and they all read French literature. I mean, it was all about French literature. And this specific kind of courtly and chivalric models that were at the base at that point of the kind of the ABC of European political and military culture. But at this point, in the between the essentially at the beginning of the 13th century, is Palermo, and in fact the court of the Hohenstaufen in Sicily to have this greater development. But in here, it's strictly not just the noblemen. Actually, these have a relatively marginal role. It's rather that compose this thing, that it's rather all that plethora of bureaucrats, of notaries and lawyers, that in order to satisfy their own prince, because Frederick II was a poet himself, he was a lover of poetry, and also as some of these sons, by the way, that began to put and written down their own vision of, in this case, of love at the service of the dame, avoiding, however, with great care, right, the political themes that instead in Provençal poetry were all over the place. The reason being that Swabian Sicily was a much more kind of autocratic power, right? Frederick II was not just Sicilian king, was king of Germany, was Holy Roman Emperor. So he was building actually in Sicily a dramatically centralized government that doesn't know equals at that point in Latin Germanic Europe. And these courtiers, we can call them, were, first of all, they were inferior in social status. Like, these were not noblemen. Like, they were extremely powerful people, but they didn't have, like, they couldn't compare to the nobility properly, and the guy was the king, right? So, differently from southern France, it was instead dramatically fragmented, politically speaking, and therefore every, satire and political criticism could, flew like crazy, because, there was no central power, right? Instead, in Sicily, this could not be possible. So in many ways, that's why partly Sicilian poetry was so kind of refined also, because it was very researched. Probably there were even certain Eastern models. I can think of the Byzantine influence at the same time, that however rendered these verses and contents somewhat more polished, more the vision of the angelic woman, for example, that is present in naturally in Occitan literature as well, but it's not as much as it would become in the Italian tradition, and would be taken once again by Dante, for example, later on, right? So that we talk eventually of a Tuscan Provençal literature that, at that point, by the way, was all one, especially after the collapse of the Hohenstaufen in Sicily, when the Angevins from Provence actually seize southern Italy, and they are all like basically they're working together with the Tuscans, because those were the ones who founded their own expedition. They were all connected, like at that point it was all about the Capetians, because even Charles of Anjou was brother to Louis IX, so it was literally an empire stretched from the Channel to Turkey, and the triad in here and the passage was, or the fourfold group here was Paris, southern France, Tuscany, Naples. This was an axis that basically developed like crazy, culturally speaking, in this essentially pre-humanistic age that produced, in fact, so much in the history of medieval civilization, and that was all soaked in these models that had previously come from the French tradition of chiefly the 12th century, right? It's very interesting about Frederick II, however, this kind of German influence. Like, for example, I don't know, in 14th century Austria, the Habsburgs were still, for example, in their theoretical, Swabian legacy, technically they were Swabian themselves. I mean, they wanted to be the next Hohenstaufen. At that point, were still, schooling their Minnesänger with people who had been scholars of the great singers at the courts of Frederick II or Manfred of Hohenstaufen in Sicily. So this is the great, like this great area between northern France, southern Germany, and essentially central and southern Italy that produced this astonishing amount of literary production and artistic, poetic production this time. It's interesting because the collapse of the Hohenstaufen, for example, King Heinz Re-Enzo, that was captured by the Bolognese after the Battle of Salta and was imprisoned. In fact, he was a son of Frederick II. He lived up to his death relegated in this prison tower. By the way, well fed, he was visited by lots of people, he had women, he had like everything, but he was in prison, and this guy kept on composing this Minnesänger, and these people were totally in love with that. And what I would like to stress about it, that it was a strictly military thing. And the astonishing fact about the Germans, that still in the second half of the 13th to the 14th century, we do know these guys started to essentially work, especially in northern central Italy, as mercenaries, as knights chiefly, because there was a major economic crisis in Germany, and also especially of the ministerialis class. That was the standard German knight, basically, especially in southern Germany, between Swabia and Bavaria, and Austria. And these guys were sometimes, and this may be incredible for us as moderns, but many of these poets, especially the German ones, presented themselves actually as illiterate, which means they effectively didn't have any higher education. Many of them were even incapable of writing, right? But they were continuing with these songs, with these compositions, an old tradition that actually from centuries, right, well before even the same French tradition, etc., had entrusted to the sole memory of the poet what he was himself composing. And that was an art that today we have lost, but in before, in fact, the High Middle Ages, this was the norm, all over Europe, and this can be extended naturally to all the other continents, right? Up to the moment of with literacy spread constantly, but there was all this world of these, like, now we are as moderns, like, paradigmatically fixated with the fact that everything we know we have to write it down. Up to these years of the Middle Ages, everything was recorded by heart. There were people who knew the Bible by heart. Now, I hope you know how long the Bible is. That these people knew that by heart, and it was fairly simple. Like, if you start from an early age to learn things by heart, and objectively you don't have many other material supports for writing because they costed. Like, paper was just spreading at this point, so parchment was dramatically expensive, aside from the fact they had butchered down entire herds of sheep, poor sheep. Think of all the sheep that have been butchered down for all the medieval manuscripts that we had before paper. The everything came spontaneously, orally, right? And it was all mnemonic. And it had been so, like, from prehistory, like that. And that's what we often, like, that's also why history of literature is important once you get a bit more thoroughly into it, because we, as moderns, we tend to read these chapters of history or literature saying, look at the great accomplishment of these guys. Finally, they started writing something down. Wow, now they were really advanced. Now they were really cool, not like before. This is actually, they got lazier. I mean, a person who needs to write something down to know it is actually essentially surrendering to use part of his brain that naturally costs energy, it costs resources in this sense, but it's still capable of doing amazing things that we are essentially all. Let's be honest. We are weak. We're eyelashes. We are like blobs. We spend all the time sit somewhere with an iPhone in our hands. These people went around, they toured the world. The myth that medieval times people essentially sat all the time or simply stayed just in their villages is a myth. These guys traveled across. Think about the Minnesänger in the second half of the 12th century. These people went. Think about Tannhäuser, the times of Frederick II. This is a guy who went to the Baltic Crusades, who toured around. These people went to the Crusades in the Near East. They went from Germany to southern Italy. They toured the Mediterranean. They fought against the most diverse peoples. I mean, this was the mindset of this specific people, naturally, because the errant knight, the knight now, how is it defining itself, does essentially that. But it's a broad view, it's a broad horizon. Think about what it was like Europe in the 13th century. Have you ever stopped thinking what it could be? What the sky could really look like with all this light and all this pollution? What forests, this green that surrounded you, these smells of nature, this physical sensations, this relation with the light and the darkness. How the electricity has changed radically our way of looking at the world. These people, think about what it means to stare at a starry sky in the most complete obscurity, and think of what can make you feel, and think at all the other things. I mean, the fact that 1/3 of the children essentially died before reaching adulthood. Life was, women also, their carriage entailed most of the times death, like by infection, or it was a terrible world. It was disgusting, but when you read this literature, well, that's when you see what those feelings, those emotions, those passions could really mean for these people. Because today we're not able to compose such verses with such a great beauty like these people did. Our culture is cheap, is dramatically cheap. These guys sweated and shed blood and cried and suffered for having that. And that's why they treasured it all in their minds and their souls, because that's what was the greatest treasure they could have to live on in a world like that. And that's what we don't understand when we read these things, because we are that desensitized at the point of that it's unbelievable. But, you know, we have something else, and that's why I always say that civilization requires a sacrifice of some kind, and today we do live better than these people, but also we feel less. And I don't know how, like, whether it's worth it or not. I assume it is, actually, because I wouldn't like, you know, to side. You know, there are all things that go wrong in this world as well, as you see, but that was much worse. But that's exactly when you put a human under pressure, that human surprises you with something that not even him or her actually thought could be possible up to that point. And alright, I was uncertain. Today I don't feel particularly well, but I didn't want to do this video. I wanted to talk about something else but I was happy now that I did it, because we managed to cover interesting concepts, and naturally we will continue on. And if you, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, if you're interested specifically in things like literature or philosophy or art, I mean, let's talk about it. I don't have any problem to prepare videos about these two, okay? So, for now, I just stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.